The VIP wing of the Azure Lounge went dead quiet the moment the crystal glass touched the boss's lips. Park Seung-ho, known as the Silent Tiger, ruler of the city's shipping lanes, was a heartbeat away from swallowing the rare amber liquid when a scream shattered the air. "Don't drink that!" Every guard spun toward the service doors. A little girl stood there, small but fierce, her simple clothes clashing against the dark luxury of the room. Her arm was outstretched, her finger pointing accusingly, and her face was twisted in pure urgency. She didn't run, she stepped past the security line. "Please," she cried out, "don't drink it!" Weapons were unholstered instantly. Monique, the waitress, lunged to cover her little sister, terror in her eyes. Park could have ended them both with a single nod, but instead, the man who was never commanded raised a hand, freezing his men in place. "Why?" he asked, his voice low but cutting through the silence. "How do you know what is in my glass?" Zora's voice trembled, but she didn't back down. "Because I saw the man who put the powder in." The room went ice cold. Then she said something that made the Korean Mafia boss's blood freeze. "He had a burn scar on his neck, and he said the tiger sleeps tonight." In that second, Park Seung-ho realized this wasn't just an assassination attempt, it was a coup, and the only thing standing between him and a violent death was the 8-year-old sister of a waitress. Welcome back to the gallery. Stay with me till the end, because what Park discovers next doesn't just expose a traitor in his inner circle, it forces a cold-hearted ruler to become a protector and threatens to burn the entire underworld to the ground. Show some love by hitting like and subscribe. Comment where you're watching from, and you're absolutely amazing. Let's get into the story. The Azure Lounge wasn't just a high-end bar. It was a stronghold. For over a decade, it had been Park Seung-ho's throne room, the place where shipping lanes were negotiated and enemies were silenced without a sound. The VIP wing was soundproofed, the entrances were scanned, and every bottle was inspected with military precision. Park didn't survive to become the Silent Tiger by trusting people. Tonight was supposed to be a victory lap. He had just consolidated the last of the city's docks. His empire was secure. His rivals were crushed. Everything was finally under his absolute control. Which made what happened next impossible. Because despite the armored doors, the loyal guards, and the tasters, the man who nearly killed him wasn't a rival gang leader or a hired gun. It was a ghost. It was someone who was supposed to have died in a warehouse fire 3 years ago, and the only person who knew the truth was an innocent child named Zora, who had nothing to gain and everything to lose. But Zora wasn't alone. Standing behind her was her older sister, Monique Carter, a woman who had spent years navigating the dangerous shadows of the Azure Lounge as a waitress, keeping her head down and her apron clean. Monique was the one who knew the weight of Park's reputation better than anyone. She knew that in this room, a single mistake didn't just get you fired, it got you erased. By allowing her sister to speak, Monique was gambling with both of their lives, trading her hard-earned invisibility for a desperate shot at doing what was right. Together, they were the ultimate outsiders, a waitress who saw everything and a child who feared nothing. Both held in the gaze of a man who could either be their executioner or their only hope for survival. The amber whiskey caught the light of the crystal chandeliers, glowing like liquid gold as Park Seung-ho raised the glass. In the VIP wing of the Azure Lounge, the atmosphere was thick with the scent of expensive cigars and the heavy, respectful silence that always accompanied the Silent Tiger's movements. His inner circle stood like statues, watching their leader prepare to toast to a new era of dominance over the city's shipping lanes. Park's fingers, adorned with a single jade ring, were steady. He was a man who had mastered the art of the calm breath, a man who believed that every threat had been neutralized. The glass was inches from his lips, the sharp, peaty aroma already filling his senses, when the heavy oak service doors didn't just open, they slammed against the marble walls. "Don't drink that!" The scream was high-pitched, jagged with a terror so raw it seemed to vibrate the very glassware on the tables. Park froze. The rim of the glass was pressing against his lower lip, the cool moisture of the condensation stinging his skin. He didn't move a muscle, his sharp eyes darting toward the source of the disruption. Standing there, framed by the shadows of the service hallway, was Zora Carter. She was small, her simple cotton dress out of place against the velvet and gold of the lounge, and her chest heaved with desperate gasps for air. Her arm was locked straight, trembling as she pointed a finger directly at the amber liquid in Park's hand. Behind her, the silhouette of her sister Monique appeared, her face a mask of sudden, paralyzing horror. The elite security detail reacted with the cold efficiency of a triggered trap. 3 suppressed pistols were leveled at the child's chest before she could take another breath. The click-clack of safeties being disengaged echoed through the room like a death knell. But Park Sang-ho didn't give the order to fire. He remained perfectly still, his gaze locked onto the little girl's wide, watering eyes. He saw no malice there, no calculated play from a rival family, only the pure, unadulterated fear of a child who had seen a monster in the dark. Slowly, with a hand that remained eerily still, Park lowered the glass. He didn't set it down. He held it at chest level, staring into the swirling amber depths as if he could finally see the invisible death hiding within. The room remained held in a suffocating tension, the air itself feeling like it might catch fire, as the most dangerous man in the city prepared to speak to the girl who had just dared to command him. The heavy silence of the lounge was replaced by the frantic, uneven breathing of a child. Park Sang-ho remained as still as a statue, the glass of poisoned whiskey held halfway between the table and his mouth. His lead enforcer, a man whose face was a map of scars, known only as Sang-woo, didn't wait for a command. With a fluid, practiced motion, he drew his weapon, the barrel of the black semi-automatic leveled directly at Zora's forehead. "Back away from the boss," Sang-woo growled, his voice a low vibration that promised sudden violence. Monique, who had been frozen in the corner with a serving tray, finally found her voice. It came out as a strangled sob. She dropped the tray, the clatter of silver against marble sounding like a gunshot, and scrambled across the floor. She threw herself over Zora, wrapping her body around the small girl to act as a human shield. "Please, don't shoot. She's just a child," Monique wailed, her eyes squeezed shut as she waited for the impact. "She doesn't know what she's doing. Please, Mr. Park, have mercy." The other guards closed in, a wall of dark suits and cold steel forming a semicircle around the sisters. The air in the VIP wing was suffocating, thick with the metallic scent of drawn weapons and the primal smell of fear. To any outsider, it looked like the end of 2 lives. But Park Sang-ho was looking at something the others had missed. He wasn't looking at the chaos or the weapons. He was looking into Zora's eyes, which were visible over Monique's shoulder. They weren't the eyes of an assassin. They weren't even the eyes of a victim pleading for her own life. They were wide, shimmering with a desperate, frantic concern, not for herself, but for him. She was watching the glass in his hand with the intensity of someone watching a ticking bomb. "Lower your steel," commanded Park. His voice wasn't loud, but it carried the weight of an iron sliding shut. Sang-woo hesitated for a fraction of a second, his finger still tense on the trigger. "I said, lower them," Park repeated, his tone sharpening. One by one, the muzzles pointed toward the floor. Park stood up slowly, his tall frame casting a long, jagged shadow over the two sisters huddled on the marble. He stepped around the table, the heels of his polished shoes clicking rhythmically. He stopped just inches from Zora, looking down at the small, trembling girl who had just risked everything to stop him from taking a single sip. He didn't see an intruder. He saw a girl who was terrified that the man standing over her was about to die. Park Sung-ho stood over the huddled sisters, his shadow a long, dark streak across the polished marble. The air in the VIP wing remained heavy, the silence broken only by Monique's soft, muffled sobs as she clung to Zora. Park reached out, his movements slow and deliberate, and placed the crystal glass on the edge of the mahogany table. He didn't look at his men. His focus remained entirely on the small girl shivering beneath her sister's protective embrace. "Explain," Park said. The word was a low vibration, devoid of anger, but saturated with an authority that demanded absolute truth. Zora looked up, her small face pale and wet with tears. She swallowed hard, her voice coming out in a thin, fragile reed. I was waiting for Monique in the back hallway," she whispered, her eyes darting toward the service doors. "The kitchen staff let me sit on the crate near the pantry. I saw a man. He didn't look like the others. He had a maintenance jacket on, but he wasn't fixing anything." She paused, her breath hitching. "He took a bottle from the special velvet box, the one with your name on the gold plate. He opened it and poured a tiny vial of silver powder inside. He shook it once, then put it back and wiped the glass with a silk cloth. He looked right at the camera and smiled." "This is a fantasy," Sang-woo hissed, stepping forward with his hand still resting on the grip of his holstered weapon. "Boss, the kitchen is a fortress. No one enters without a biometric scan. This girl is a distraction, a plant by the triads to make us paranoid. We should remove them and finish the toast." Park ignored his lieutenant. He picked up the glass again, bringing it slowly toward his face. He didn't drink. Instead, he swirled the amber liquid, watching how it coated the sides of the crystal. To any untrained eye, it was perfect. He leaned in, inhaling deeply. It was odorless, carrying only the familiar smoky notes of the rare malt. But then, he tilted the glass toward the light of the chandelier. His eyes narrowed. In the very heart of the amber depths, there was a faint, almost imperceptible swirl of iridescent violet, a shimmer that shouldn't have been there. It looked like oil on water, a beautiful, deadly blemish in the gold. The color was off by a fraction of a shade, a detail only a man who had survived a dozen poisonings would notice. Park's jaw tightened, a muscle leaping in his cheek. He looked at the bottle on the tray, the one Zora had described. The seal was perfect, yet the truth was shimmering in his hand. He realized then that Zora wasn't just a witness, she was a miracle he hadn't asked for. He turned his gaze back to the service door, his voice turning to ice. "The girl is not lying," Park said, his voice sending a chill through every man in the room. "But the cameras are." Park Sung-ho set the glass down with a clinical precision that was more terrifying than a shout. The faint violet shimmer in the whiskey seemed to pulse under the light, a silent testament to the girl's honesty. He turned his attention back to Zora, who was still huddled on the floor, her small frame vibrating against Monique's protective embrace.
"The man you saw," Park began, his voice dropping into a register that was eerily soft. "Tell me everything about him. Don't leave out a single detail, no matter how small." Zora took a shaky breath, her eyes darting toward the shadows of the room, as if the intruder might materialize from the velvet curtains. He was tall, but he walked with a slight limp, like his left leg was heavy. He wore the blue maintenance jumpsuit, but it didn't fit right in the shoulders. It was too big. She closed her eyes, trying to sharpen the memory. But it was his face. When he reached for the bottle, his collar slipped. There was a scar, a jagged, angry burn that started at his jaw and disappeared under his shirt. It looked like a lightning bolt made of red silk. The air in the room seemed to vanish. Sang-woo, who had been ready to dismiss the girl moments ago, suddenly went ashen, his hand dropping away from his weapon as if he had lost the strength to hold it. Park's expression didn't change, but his eyes turned into shards of black glass. "Anything else?" Park prompted, his posture becoming dangerously rigid. "He was nervous," Zora whispered. Even though he was smiling at the camera, his left hand wouldn't stop moving. He had a silver lighter, the kind that flips open with a loud click. He kept flicking it open and shut, over and over. Click, snap, click, snap. He did it 3 times before he put the bottle back and walked away. The silence that followed was absolute. Not a single bodyguard shifted his weight. Not a single tray rattled. The mention of the silver lighter and the jagged burn scar acted like a physical blow to everyone in Park's inner circle.
For 3 years, that description had belonged to a ghost. It belonged to Lee Min-jae, the man Park had called brother, the man who had supposedly been incinerated in the warehouse fire at the docks, a fire Park himself had sanctioned to erase a betrayal. Park Seung-ho's hand slowly went to his own throat, tracing the space where his brother used to stand. The silent tiger looked around his fortress, and for the first time in a decade, he didn't see a sanctuary. He saw a cage. If Min-jae was alive, the rules of the underworld had just been rewritten in blood, and the monster he thought he had buried was already inside the house. The color drained from Park Seung-ho's face, leaving him looking like a ghost himself. He stood motionless, his jade ring catching the dim light as his mind raced back 3 years to a night dominated by the roar of flames and the scent of burning diesel. "Min-jae," he whispered, the name tasting like ash. Around him, the air in the VIP wing seemed to solidify. His men exchanged glances of pure dread. They all remembered the warehouse fire at the Incheon docks, a night of cleansing where Park had personally overseen the destruction of a faction that had grown too ambitious. Lee Min-jae, Park's adoptive brother and most trusted enforcer, had been trapped in the heart of that inferno. Park had watched the building collapse into a skeletal ruin of molten steel, certain that no soul could have survived the heat. It had been a necessary cruelty, a mess that needed to be erased to ensure Park's absolute rise to power. But the description Zora provided, the jagged lightning bolt of a scar on the neck, the specific silver lighter, was undeniable. Min-jae hadn't died. He had merely been forged in the fire Park created, transformed into a vengeful phantom who had spent 3 years lurking in the shadows of the city he once helped rule. The realization hit Park with the force of a physical blow. He hadn't just failed to kill his rival, he had created his own perfect executioner. Min-jae knew every secret, every security blind spot, and every person Park loved, or pretended to. The silent tiger felt a rare, cold shiver of vulnerability. If Min-jae was here, inside the Azure Lounge, it meant the fortress was already breached. He looked at the whiskey glass again. The subtle violet shimmer was no longer just a sign of poison, it was a signature. Min-jae was sending a message. He wasn't just coming for Park's life, he was coming for his legacy, starting with the very drink meant to celebrate his greatest victory. Park turned to Sang-woo, his voice a low, dangerous rasp. "Check the perimeter, every floor, every closet. If he's alive, he's not alone, and find out who told him I was drinking the 25-year-old malt tonight." The ghost of his brother was no longer a memory. He was a hunter, and for the first time in his life, Park Seung-ho felt like prey. The cold weight of the realization settled in Park's chest like lead. He didn't just have a ghost at his gates, he had a traitor at his table. Slowly, Park turned his gaze away from the shimmering glass and toward the line of men standing in the shadows of the lounge. His eyes, usually sharp and calculating, were now predatory. He scanned their faces, men he had bled with, men he had enriched, men who owed their very lives to his shadow. If Min Jae, a man with a face marked by fire, had managed to walk into the heart of the Azure Lounge's kitchen, he hadn't done it by luck. He had been guided. "Sangwoo," Park said, his voice a jagged whisper that cut through the tension. "Who cleared the kitchen staff for tonight's shift?" Sangwoo straightened, his brow furrowed as he checked a digital tablet pulled from his inner pocket. "Everything was protocol, boss. The rosters were finalized this morning by the floor manager, Kim Dae-yoon." Park's eyes narrowed. "And where is Dae-yoon now? He is usually the first to pour the celebratory round." A heavy, suffocating silence followed. Sangwoo looked around the room, his expression shifting from confusion to a dawning, frantic alarm. He spoke into his earpiece, his voice tight. "Security, locate Manager Kim. Status report, now." There was no answer. Only the hollow hiss of static filled the line. Monique, still clutching Zora on the floor, let out a small, trembling breath. He was the one who told me to bring the special bottle," she whispered, her voice cracking. "He told me to make sure I served it only to you, Mr. Park. He said it was your favorite, and that I shouldn't let anyone else touch the glass." Park's jaw tightened until the bone threatened to snap. It was a perfect trap. Dae-hyun, a man who had served Park for 7 years, had handpicked the waitress with the most to lose, knowing her desperation would make her a reliable, if unwitting, delivery system for the poison. The betrayal wasn't coming from across the city or from a rival port. It was vibrating through the very floorboards beneath his feet. The shift manager wasn't just missing. He was the key that had unlocked the fortress for a dead man. "The cameras," Park commanded, his voice turning into a growl. "Dae-hyun didn't just walk out. He's either running or he's waiting to finish what the poison started. Seal every exit. No one leaves this building. Not the guests, not the staff, and especially the men I pay to protect me." He looked at the service doors Zora had run through. The lounge, once his sanctuary, now felt like a tomb. The enemy wasn't just at the gates. The enemy was the gatekeeper. In the middle of the mounting chaos, as his men barked orders into radios and shadows stretched across the marble floor like grasping fingers, Park Seung-ho did something that stunned his entire inner circle. He knelt. Ignoring the potential of a sniper's bullet or the presence of a traitor in the room, he brought himself down to Zora's level. He was no longer the silent tiger looking down from a throne. He was a man searching for a truth that couldn't be found in a ledger or a lie detector. He looked at the girl, her small frame still trembling under Monique's protective arm, and felt a strange, uncomfortable hitch in his chest. "Zora," he said, his voice stripped of its usual icy edge. "Look at me." The girl lifted her head, her dark eyes swimming with tears. "You know who I am," Park continued softly. "You know that people are afraid to even speak my name in this city. You saw the guns. You saw the danger. Why did you run in here? Why did you save a man like me?" Monique held her breath, her knuckles white as she squeezed her sister's shoulder. The guard stood frozen, watching the most powerful man in the criminal underworld wait for an answer from a child who owned nothing. Zora wiped her nose with the back of her hand, her voice small but steady. "My daddy? He died a long time ago," she whispered. "He worked in a place like this. One night he came home and drank something from a bottle he found.
He started shaking. He couldn't breathe. She looked directly into Park's sharp eyes, her gaze unflinching. He looked so scared, Mr. Park. I saw his face, and he looked like he was falling into a dark hole and couldn't find the light. When I saw that man in the kitchen with your bottle, I saw that same look coming for you. I didn't want you to look scared like my daddy. No one should have to look that scared.
The words hit Park with more force than any physical blow Lee Min-jae had ever landed. For years, Park had prided himself on his isolation, believing that being feared was the only way to be safe. He had built a fortress of steel and silence, convinced that he was untouchable. But in the simple, devastating logic of a child's trauma, he saw the truth. He was just a man who had forgotten what it felt like to be seen as human. Zora wasn't protecting a boss or a kingdom. She was protecting a soul she didn't even know he had. The emotional armor Park had worn for decades didn't just crack, it shattered. For the first time in 30 years, the silent tiger didn't feel powerful. He felt responsible. He reached out, his hand hovering for a second before gently resting on Zora's head. "You did well, Zora," he murmured, his voice thick with a sudden, unfamiliar warmth. "I promise you, no one is going to be scared tonight. Not anymore." The warmth of the moment was severed by a sudden sharp intake of breath as Zora's eyes widened, her memory jolting back to the hallway. She grabbed the sleeve of Park's tailored jacket, her small fingers bunching the expensive wool. "He was talking to someone on a headset. He didn't know I was there. He laughed, Mr. Park. He said the poison was just the appetizer. He said the tiger falls at midnight and the city wakes up under a new moon." The air in the VIP wing seemed to plummet in temperature. Park Sung-ho went perfectly still, the girl's words echoing in his mind like a countdown. The tiger falls at midnight. It wasn't just a hit on his life, it was a synchronized execution of his entire legacy. With a slow, rhythmic movement of his wrist, Park checked his Patek Philippe. The moonlight silver face of the watch gleamed under the chandeliers. The sweeping second hand was moving with indifferent, lethal precision. It was 11:45 p.m. 15 minutes. He had 15 minutes before the ghost of Lee Min-jae unleashed whatever hell he had been preparing for 3 years. Park's mind, usually a fortress of cold logic, began to map the possibilities with terrifying speed. If the poison was the appetizer, then the main course was already in position. The shipping consolidation, the arms deal at the docks, the loyalist captain stationed across the city, every pillar of his empire was likely wired to explode the moment the clock struck 12. "Sang-woo!" Park roared, the sound of his voice finally breaking the trance of the room. He stood up, the vulnerability of the previous moment replaced by a terrifying, cold clarity. "Get the tactical feed from the docks on the main screen, now, and tell the perimeter teams to switch to secondary encrypted channels. If Min-jae is timing this, he's already listening to our primary frequencies." The lounge erupted into a frenzy of controlled motion. Guards scrambled to secure the windows, and the heavy thud of the magnetic locks engaging on the main doors echoed like a series of hammer strikes. Monique pulled Zora closer, her face pale as she realized that the safe room was quickly becoming a target. Park didn't look at the whiskey glass again. He looked at the shadows dancing on the wall, seeing the silhouette of the brother he thought he had killed. The clock was no longer just a luxury on his wrist. It was a heartbeat, and it was slowing down. He had 15 minutes to find the ghost, or he would become one himself. The rhythmic ticking of the Patek Philippe felt like a hammer striking an anvil. Park Sung-ho looked at the service doors, then back at the two sisters.
Outside, the muffled sound of a distant siren began to wail, growing louder with every passing second. He knew how Min Jae operated. The phone call Zora overheard was the signal for the wolves to descend. The Azure Lounge was no longer a palace, it was a kill zone. "Sang-woo, kill the exterior lights," Park commanded, his voice vibrating with a sudden, sharp intensity. "Seal the service lift and vent the gas lines. If they're coming through the front." Monique clutched Zora to her chest, her eyes darting toward the exits. "We have to go," she whispered, her voice cracking with desperation. "Please, Mr. Park, we'll just leave through the back. We won't say a word to anyone. Just let us run." Park turned to her, and for the first time, Monique saw the true weight of the man behind the title. His eyes weren't cold anymore. They were burning with a protective fury. He stepped forward and gripped her shoulder, his hand steady and immovable. "If you walk out those doors, you are dead before you reach the sidewalk," Park said, his voice dropping into a solemn rasp. "Min Jae doesn't leave witnesses, and he certainly doesn't leave miracles behind. You didn't just save my life, you became a target in his war." He looked down at Zora, who was watching him with a strange, quiet trust. He reached out and touched the girl's shoulder. "You saved the king tonight, Zora, and in this city, that means something." He looked back at Monique, his gaze steeling. "The king protects you now. On my soul, no harm will reach either of you while I still draw breath."
He didn't wait for a reply. He gestured toward the far wall, where a seamless panel of black obsidian sat behind his desk. He pressed his thumb against a hidden biometric scanner. With a heavy, pneumatic hiss, the wall slid back to reveal a reinforced steel vault, his private sanctuary lined with lead and independent oxygen tanks. "Get inside," he ordered. "There is water, food, and a direct line to my personal detail. Do not open this door for anyone but me, not even if you hear my voice outside. Only me." As the sisters scrambled into the silver-lined safety of the panic room, Zora turned back one last time. "Don't look scared, Mr. Park," she whispered. Park Seung-ho managed a grim, thin smile, the first his men had seen in years. "I'm not scared, little one," he said, as the heavy steel door began to grind shut. "I'm awake." The heavy steel door of the vault hissed shut, sealing the innocence of the Carter sisters away from the coming storm. In the sudden, oppressive quiet of the darkened lounge, Park Seung-ho stood alone for a heartbeat, staring at his own reflection in the obsidian wall. The man staring back was no longer a CEO or diplomat of the underworld. He was a predator. With slow, deliberate movements, Park shed his tailored suit jacket, letting the $1,000 fabric fall unceremoniously to the floor. He began to roll up the sleeves of his white silk shirt, uncovering the ink that climbed his arms like rising smoke. Complex, traditional Irizumi patterns of crashing waves and snarling tigers wrapped around his forearms, marks of the blood he had spilled and the wars he had survived long before he owned a skyscraper. Sang-woo stepped out of the shadows, holding a heavy tactical case. Without a word, Park reached in and retrieved a customized silver handgun, the twin to the one Lee Min-jae used to carry. He checked the chamber with a metallic snick that echoed through the hollow room. He then strapped a combat knife to his thigh, the leather cinching tight against his trousers. "The perimeter is breached, boss," Sang-woo reported, his voice tight. "They're cutting the secondary power. We have 3 minutes." Park looked at the 10 loyalists remaining in the room. They were the ones who hadn't flinched when the guns were drawn on the girl, the ones who had stayed by his side when the word poison was whispered. He saw the flicker of fear in their eyes, and he addressed it with the roar of a king. Tonight, they thought they were coming to a funeral. Park's voice carried a terrifying, jagged edge that galvanized the men. They thought the tiger was old, soft, and sleeping, but they forgot one thing. This is my jungle, and I know every shadow they intend to hide in. If Lee Min-jae wants his ghost to walk again, he'll have to go through me to get to the light. A chorus of rhythmic weapon checks answered him. The clocks struck 12. A deafening explosion rocked the front of the Azure Lounge, followed immediately by the melodic, high-pitched shatter of the floor-to-ceiling reinforced windows. The sirens outside reached a fever pitch, screaming in harmony with the wind that tore through the broken glass. Park Seung-ho didn't take cover. He stepped over the shattered remains of his whiskey glass, his polished shoes crunching on the crystal shards. Through the billowing smoke and the strobing red and blue lights of the street, a silhouette emerged. A tall man with a jagged scar and a silver lighter clicking rhythmically in his hand. Park raised his weapon, his eyes locked onto the phantom of his brother. The tiger was no longer just awake. He was hunting. With a roar of defiance that drowned out the chaos, Park Seung-ho stepped into the fray to reclaim his empire. The smoke from the breach curled around the velvet curtains like a living thing. Through the haze, Lee Min-jae stepped into the light of the flickering chandeliers. The burn scar on his neck looked like a jagged brand in the strobing red of the police sirens outside. He wasn't wearing a maintenance jumpsuit anymore. He was clad in a sharp gray suit, a mockery of the brotherhood they once shared. "You always did have a weakness for the dramatic, Seung-ho," Min-jae said, his voice a gravelly ruin. He flicked the silver lighter. Click, snap. "But relying on a child, you've grown desperate in your old age." "I grew wise, Min-jae," Park replied, his handgun leveled at his brother's chest. "I stopped looking at the horizon for enemies and started looking at the people I ignored. That's why you failed. You thought the small people didn't have eyes." Min-jae laughed, a hollow sound that lacked any warmth. "I didn't fail. Look around you. The docks are burning. Your accounts are frozen. The city doesn't belong to a tiger who hides in a lounge. It belongs to the man who survives the fire." As the two men faced off, the lounge erupted into a symphony of chaos. Min-jae's mercenaries surged through the shattered windows, but Park's loyalists were ready. They fought with a ferocity born of a new purpose. They weren't just protecting a boss, they were defending a sanctuary that had been consecrated by the bravery of a little girl.
Sang-woo moved like a blur of shadow, intercepting a hitman who had aimed for Park's flank. The air was filled with the scent of cordite and the deafening roar of gunfire. Amidst the violence, Park and Min-jae circled each other, a dance they had practiced 1,000 times in their youth, now played out for real. "You sent a man into my kitchen," Park hissed, firing a shot that grazed Min-jae's shoulder. "You used a waitress and a child as pawns. You've lost your honor, brother." "Honor didn't keep me warm in the ashes of that warehouse," Min-jae roared, lunging forward. He knocked the gun from Park's hand, and the two crashed into the mahogany bar, shattering the very bottle of whiskey that was meant to be Park's end. They grappled on the floor, surrounded by broken glass and spilled amber spirits. Min-jae pinned Park down, his hands reaching for Park's throat. "I'm the ghost you made," Min-jae snarled, "and ghosts don't die." Park looked up, not with fear, but with a cold, focused clarity. He reached for the combat knife strapped to his thigh and drove the handle, not the blade, into Min-jae's temple. As Min-jae slumped, dazed, Park rolled over and pinned him, the blade of the knife pressing against the jagged scar on Min-jae's neck. "You're not a ghost," Park whispered, his breath heavy. "You're just a man who forgot that family isn't about blood. It's about who stands for you when the world is burning." Outside, the sounds of battle began to fade. The police, finally breaking through Min-jae's perimeter, swarmed the building.
Sang-woo stood over the captured traitors, his face bloodied but triumphant. Park looked down at Min-jae, who was gasping for air, the fire in his eyes finally flickering out. Park didn't kill him. He stood up, sheathing his knife. Take him. Let the city see what happens to ghosts who try to haunt the living. When the sun began to rise over the city, the Azure Lounge was a ruin of glass and smoke. Park Sung-ho stood by the sealed vault, his white shirt stained with soot and blood. With a trembling hand, he pressed his thumb to the scanner. The door hissed open. Monique and Zora stepped out, their faces pale but unhurt. Zora looked at the wreckage of the room, then up at Park. She saw the blood on his knuckles, but she also saw the look in his eyes. The fear was gone, replaced by a profound, quiet peace. "Is it over?" Zora asked softly. Park knelt one last time, ignoring the sting in his joints. He took a small gold tiger pendant from his pocket, a family heirloom he had carried for decades, and placed it in Zora's hand. "The tiger is stepping down, Zora," Park said. "This city needs a protector, not a predator, and I think I know where to start." Park Sung-ho didn't return to his shipping lanes or his arms deals. He used his remaining influence to dismantle the very empire he had built, turning his wealth into a shield for the people the city had forgotten. Monique and Zora never went back to the kitchens. They became the heart of a new kind of family, one built not on fear, but on the courage of a girl who dared to shout. The tiger had finally found his peace, and it all began with a scream in the dark. He does not need to roar to prove he is powerful. He only needs to ensure that the smaller creatures in his woods can sleep without fear. Loyalty is rare, but these stories are even rarer. Subscribe now to stay tuned for more high-stakes accounts of courage, betrayal, and redemption. We'll see you in the next one. Merry Christmas.